I thought I'd die a virgin until an Apache girl taught me everything. He had always been a quiet boy, the kind who stayed in the background and watched the world go by. While other children laughed and played together, he preferred the corners, where the noise felt distant and the chaos of life seemed smaller. Even as a teenager, he often felt invisible. He wondered if anyone really noticed him, or if he would always be the one who just existed without leaving a mark. People would talk about their adventures, their crushes, their dreams, but he never joined in. The words never came out. It wasn't that he didn't want friends or relationships. He did. But something inside him made him doubt that anyone could ever care for him the way he wished they would. Bas. He grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and gossip spread like fire. At school, he watched friends pairing up, joking with girls, or sharing stories about their first experiences. He listened quietly, smiling when expected, laughing when everyone else laughed, but inside a storm of insecurity brewed. He felt awkward, out of place, and unworthy. But he thought that maybe the problem wasn't with him, it was with everyone else. Maybe he just hadn't found the right person yet. But as years passed, the thought that he might grow old alone started to creep in. The fear wasn't loud. It was a quiet, gnawing shadow that followed him wherever he went. His family was kind, but they didn't notice the depth of his worries. His parents always told him, "You'll find someone when the time is right," as if that could erase years of anxiety. His siblings seemed naturally confident, easy with people and full of life. Watching them, he felt smaller. Not because they were better, but because he felt trapped inside himself, unable to share the same energy. He tried to copy their behavior sometimes, smiling more, talking louder, joking more, but it never felt real. It was like wearing clothes that didn't fit, uncomfortable and strange. So, he retreated more often to solitude, where there were no expectations, no judgments, and no risks. Books became his companions. He read stories of adventure, romance, and courage, imagining himself in places he couldn't reach. He dreamed of being someone confident, someone brave, someone who could connect with others without fear. But when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see that person. He saw someone hesitant, awkward, and unsure. He began telling himself stories that explained his loneliness. But I'm too shy, he would think. No one would like me. I'll probably die a virgin. At first it sounded dramatic, almost funny, but over time it became a reality in his mind. He started to believe it as a fact, not just a fear. Every day followed a predictable pattern. Wake up, go to work, go home, scroll on his phone, watch TV, sleep. Life was safe, quiet, and predictable. There were no surprises, no risks, and no deep connections. Sometimes he would see couples walking hand in hand, laughing together, and a wave of envy and sadness would hit him. He wondered if he was missing something important, a part of life everyone else seemed to understand. But he didn't hate people for having it. He just wanted a chance to experience it himself. But the thought of reaching out, of trying to connect, felt terrifying. What if he failed? What if he was rejected? The fear of humiliation kept him locked away in his own mind, repeating the same routine day after day. Work was another place where his loneliness was both hidden and amplified. He had good colleagues who were polite, sometimes even friendly, but he never felt close to them. He listened to their stories, contributed when necessary, but never opened up about his life. Sharing his fears felt impossible. There was always the worry that someone would laugh at him or think less of him. So he built invisible walls, smiling politely while keeping his heart carefully tucked away behind them. Even when colleagues invited him to parties or social events, he often declined. Not because he hated fun, but because stepping into the unknown, meeting new people, felt overwhelming. Despite the fear, there was a small part of him that longed for change. But sometimes late at night, he would imagine what it would be like to meet someone who understood him. Someone who didn't judge or push him into being someone he wasn't. He imagined conversations that flowed easily, laughter that felt natural, and moments of connection that made his heart race with happiness instead of fear. These dreams were brief, fragile, but powerful enough to give him a spark of hope. He didn't know if such a person existed, or if he would ever meet them, but thinking about it made life feel slightly less heavy. One evening, after another long day, he walked through the quiet streets of his town. But the air was cool, the sky painted in shades of purple and orange. He noticed couples walking past, holding hands, sharing quiet laughter. He smiled to himself, pretending not to care, but inside he felt the familiar ache of longing. Then something shifted. He realized that the fear of being alone had become so large that it prevented him from noticing the small joys around him. He had forgotten that life could have moments of connection, even outside romance. A stranger smiled at him, and for the first time in a long time he smiled back without hesitation. It was a small act, but it stirred something deep inside. A reminder that life had opportunities if he was willing to take tiny steps toward them. He also began noticing patterns in himself. He realized that his fear wasn't permanent. It was learned. Over time, his shy, cautious behavior had created walls that now seemed impossible to climb. But if he could recognize the walls, maybe he could start dismantling them, brick by brick. He didn't know how, or if it would work, but the idea itself was exciting. For the first time in years, he considered the possibility that life might hold something unexpected, someone who could see him as more than invisible, someone who could help him see himself as worthy. Even with this spark of hope, he remained cautious. He didn't rush, didn't force himself to talk to people immediately. Instead, he started small, smiling more, saying hello to neighbors, making short conversation at work. These tiny actions felt uncomfortable at first, like learning to walk again after a long injury. But each small success, each friendly interaction, gave him confidence. Slowly, he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life didn't have to end in loneliness. Maybe there was someone out there who could change everything for him. And yet, he knew deep down that meeting that person would require more than luck. It would require courage, trust, and a willingness to step outside the quiet world he had built for himself. He didn't know when or how it would happen, but the thought itself became a companion, keeping him awake at night in a way that wasn't anxiety, but anticipation. For the first time, he felt that his story was waiting to be written, and that perhaps the next chapter might bring something he had only dared to imagine in dreams. Desk. He didn't yet know who would enter his life, or how, or when. But for the first time in years, he no longer believed that he was destined to die a virgin, alone, or invisible. That fear still lingered in the background, like a shadow that hadn't yet disappeared, but the light of hope had grown stronger. It was small, flickering, uncertain, but it was enough to make him feel alive again, and for him, that was the most important first step.
He never expected her to appear in his life.
It happened on an ordinary day, the kind he had grown used to. Wake up, go to work, return home, repeat. He had stopped hoping for surprises, believing that his life would continue quietly, uneventfully, and alone. But life has a way of catching people when they least expect it. He first noticed her at a small community event held in the local park. The town wasn't large, so gatherings were rare, and he had almost skipped it, thinking he would just stand on the sidelines as usual. But something, he wasn't sure what, made him walk there that day. Perhaps it was a quiet longing for change, or maybe it was just the pull of curiosity. Either way, he found himself wandering through the rows of stalls and people, feeling like an invisible observer. Then he saw her. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't stand out in the way many people tried to, demanding attention. Instead, there was a quiet confidence in her posture, the way she moved, the calmness in her eyes. She had a presence that seemed natural, effortless, and yet magnetic. Something about her made him pause, as if the world had slowed for a moment. She smiled at someone passing by, not for show but with genuine warmth. And in that moment, he felt something stir inside him, a mixture of curiosity, nervousness, and hope. He didn't approach her immediate. Part of him wanted to. Part of him feared rejection. He had spent so long avoiding these moments, telling himself that he wasn't capable, that no one would understand him, that he was destined to remain invisible. But he found himself returning to the same spot, watching her from a distance, noticing the little things, how she laughed softly to herself, how she helped someone who had dropped a bag, how she listened when people spoke to her, really listened. Narration. She had a patience and kindness that seemed rare in the world. Finally, something shifted. A stray ball rolled near him, and she bent down to pick it up. She looked at him and smiled, and without thinking, he spoke. "Thanks," he said, his voice small and hesitant. Psst. She nodded and said, "No problem. Are you okay?" Her voice wasn't condescending or fake. It was gentle, and it carried an understanding that he had never felt before. He nodded, feeling awkward, but also strangely seen. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone might notice more than just the surface of him. From that moment, a conversation began. At first, it was small talk, the kind most people think is meaningless. But to him, every word mattered.
He talked about the weather, about the event, about small things he usually kept inside.
And she listened. Truly listened. She didn't interrupt, judge, or rush him. She made him feel like what he was saying mattered. And that simple act, listening, was powerful. He hadn't realized how much he craved someone who could really hear him. Over the next few weeks, they met several times by chance. Sometimes at the park, sometimes at a local cafe. She never forced conversation, but she always made space for it to happen. Slowly, he began to open up, sharing small stories about his life, his fears, and his quiet longings. She asked questions, not in a nosy way, but in a way that showed she genuinely wanted to understand him. And in answering, he began to understand himself better. But speaking aloud made his thoughts clearer. Sharing made his fears feel smaller. She didn't try to fix him or rush him into anything. She simply showed him another way of being. With her, he didn't feel pressure to act like someone he wasn't. He didn't have to pretend to be confident or funny or bold. He could just be himself, awkward, shy, uncertain, and she treated him with respect. That respect, that acceptance was new to him. He had spent so many years feeling invisible, feeling that no one would care, that he never realized how much it could heal to simply be seen. What struck him most was her understanding of life. She spoke about her own experiences with honesty and courage, not as lessons for him, but as stories of her journey. She shared moments when she had been afraid, lonely, or uncertain. And when she did, he realized that even confident, strong people had insecurities. That realization gave him hope. If she could navigate her fears, maybe he could too. And if she could do it while remaining kind and grounded, maybe he could learn to do the same. He began noticing subtle changes in himself. Walking to work felt a little lighter. He smiled more at strangers. He spoke a little louder in meetings. Each small action was a victory, even if it didn't seem like much. Breath. And each time he saw her, he felt an encouragement he hadn't felt from anyone else. She didn't push him to be someone he wasn't, but she inspired him to become the best version of himself. And slowly, the fear that had dominated his life began to loosen its grip. One afternoon, they sat on a bench in the park, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. He found himself telling her things he had never said to anyone, his fear of never finding love, his shame about feeling invisible, his worries that he might never experience life fully. She listened quietly, her eyes steady on his face. Then, she said something simple, something that struck him deeply. "You are more than your fears. You are already enough." Those words echoed in his mind long after he left. They weren't magic. They didn't erase all his insecurities, but they were a seed, a spark. They were proof that someone could see him, understand him, and believe in him without expecting anything in return. And for the first time, he felt that maybe he didn't have to live a life defined by fear. Maybe he could grow, learn, and take chances. And maybe life could surprise him in ways he had never imagined. Days turned into weeks, and their connection deepened naturally. He looked forward to seeing her, not with desperation, but with anticipation. He wanted to learn from her, to share moments, to experience life alongside someone who didn't judge him. He began noticing the way she approached problems, how she handled challenges, calmly and patiently. He began to admire her courage, her self-respect, and her ability to stay true to herself. She taught him, without words, that strength wasn't about being loud or bold. It was about being steady, aware, and kind. Breath. He also started reflecting on his past in a new way. The quiet, lonely years no longer seemed wasted. They were preparation. Without them, he might not have recognized the value of her presence. Without them, he might not have appreciated the lessons she was subtly teaching. He began to see his life as a story still unfolding, one that could change with effort, courage, and openness. There were moments of doubt, of course. Sometimes he worried that he wasn't worthy of her attention, that she would get tired of his shyness, that he would fail. But she never gave him reason to believe that. She treated him with patience, respect, and quiet encouragement. Slowly, he began to replace fear with curiosity, and shame with hope. He realized that he didn't have to rush to change himself completely. He only needed to take small, steady steps toward growth. By the end of that season, he had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. Meeting her had opened a door inside him, a door he didn't even know existed.
He discovered that connections weren't about perfection or bravado. They were about honesty, trust, and willingness to grow.
He learned that being vulnerable was not weakness, but a way to invite others into his life. Most importantly, he learned that intimacy, the kind that matters most, is not just about relationships or physical experiences. It is about connection, understanding, and mutual respect. And though he didn't yet know where their journey would lead, he felt a sense of hope that he had never felt before. Meeting her had been unexpected, almost magical. But it wasn't a fairy tale. It was real life, messy and beautiful, full of learning and growth. And for the first time in years, he felt ready to step forward, slowly but surely, into a life that was richer, fuller, and far more alive than the quiet, lonely days he had once accepted as his fate.
He never imagined that a single person could change the way he saw himself.
But she did. Slowly, steadily, she began to teach him things no one ever had, not by lecturing, not by pushing, but through small, everyday lessons that sank deep into his mind. It began with simple conversations, yet each word carried weight. She taught him that life wasn't about being perfect, or hiding mistakes, or pretending to be someone you weren't. Life, she explained, was about being honest with yourself and others, about noticing your strengths and weaknesses without judgment, and about having courage even when it felt impossible. At first, he struggled to understand. He had spent so many years believing he was unworthy and invisible and incapable. Hearing someone tell him otherwise felt strange, almost unbelievable. He wanted to resist, to hide behind the wall he had built for decades. But she didn't push. She simply gave him space to absorb, reflect, and decide for himself. When she shared her thoughts, she used examples from her own life. Bang. She talked about moments she had failed, moments she had been afraid, and how she had found strength by facing them, one step at a time. For the first time, he realized that courage wasn't something you were born with. It was something you could learn. One day they walked together through a quiet forest near the town. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting warm patterns on the path. He spoke about his fears, how he had always believed he would remain alone, how he doubted he could ever feel confident or loved. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply said, "Your fears are real, but they do not define you. You can face them slowly and become stronger than you think." Her words were simple, yet profound. He had never heard anything like that before. No one had ever acknowledged his fear without judgment, and no one had ever offered hope without strings attached. It was the first time he realized that being vulnerable could be safe, that showing someone your true self didn't have to end in rejection or shame. She taught him that the first step toward change was understanding yourself, not blaming yourself. Not blaming yourself. Over the following weeks, she continued teaching in subtle ways. She invited him to try new activities with her, small adventures that pushed him outside his comfort zone. They went hiking along trails he had never dared to explore alone, shared quiet picnics by rivers he had always passed without noticing, and even tried simple art projects together. Each activity seemed ordinary, but for him, it was extraordinary. He discovered that stepping into new experiences was not as frightening as he had imagined. The fear was there, but it could be managed, confronted, and even transformed into excitement. One afternoon, while sitting by the river, she asked him to close his eyes and imagine the life he wanted, without thinking about failure or fear.
"Picture it exactly how you want it," she said.
No limits, just honesty. He hesitated, unsure if he could truly allow himself to dream. But as he imagined the life he wanted, one with friends, experiences, confidence, and connection, he felt a warmth inside that he hadn't known in years. She smiled and said, "This is your mind. It is powerful. You can build the life you want, but first you have to believe it is possible." She also taught him the importance of self-respect and boundaries. He had spent so much of his life avoiding people, fearing rejection, and doubting his worth. She showed him that valuing yourself was not selfish. It was necessary. She explained that healthy relationships, friendships, and connections only worked when both people respected themselves and each other. He realized that much of his anxiety came from not knowing how to respect himself or assert his needs. This realization was painful at first, but it was also freeing. She also helped him confront the negative stories he told himself.
For decades, he had believed that he was unworthy of love and connection.
She encouraged him to question these thoughts, to examine their truth, and to replace them with more balanced, realistic beliefs. Slowly, he started telling himself new stories. I am worthy of kindness. I can connect with others. I can grow, even if I am afraid. Each statement felt strange at first, but over time it became natural. He began to see himself not as broken, but as a person who was learning, growing, and capable. Their time together was not without challenges. There were moments when he felt frustrated with himself, when old fears returned, when the weight of years of loneliness seemed unbearable. But she was always there, patiently guiding him, reminding him to take one step at a time. She never criticized him for struggling, and she celebrated small victories. And in celebrating these small moments, he began to see that progress didn't have to be sudden or dramatic. Growth could be quiet, subtle, and steady. One evening, they sat around a small campfire during a weekend trip to the hills. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly above. He felt a quiet happiness he had never experienced before, a feeling of being understood, accepted, and encouraged. She spoke about her own fears and the ways she overcame them. She told him that life was not about never feeling afraid, but about acting despite fear. She said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, it is moving forward even when you are afraid." Those words stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after the fire had burned down. Through her lessons, he began noticing changes not only inside but also in how he interacted with the world. He smiled more at strangers, spoke more confidently at work, and began forming friendships he had previously avoided. Brave. Each new connection reinforced the lesson she had taught him, that he was capable of growth, that he could engage with the world, and that vulnerability could lead to meaningful relationships. He realized that the fear he had carried for so long had been a barrier, not an unchangeable truth. One of the most important lessons she gave him was about patience and self-compassion. He had spent so many years criticizing himself for being shy or slow to act. She taught him that growth takes time and that it is okay to stumble along the way. She said, "Treat yourself with the same kindness you would offer a friend. You are learning, and that is enough." Breaths. For the first time, he felt he could forgive himself for past mistakes, for years of inaction, and for the fear that had held him back. He also began to understand the power of trust. She showed him that trusting someone didn't mean giving up control or exposing weakness. It meant allowing another person to see you, to support you, and to walk beside you. He realized that his loneliness had been partly due to fear of trust, but that trust could also bring freedom. And as he began to trust her, he felt his heart open in ways he had never experienced before. By the end of this period, he was no longer the same person who had once believed he would live a lonely life. Meeting her had shown him that growth was possible, that fear could be managed, and that connection and self-worth were not distant dreams but achievable realities. She had taught him to face his insecurities, to believe in himself, and to see the beauty in both life and himself. The lessons went far beyond romance. They were lessons about living fully, honestly, and bravely. He began to anticipate life differently. Instead of fearing rejection or loneliness, he looked forward to new experiences, new conversations, and new opportunities to connect. He had discovered that the world was not as intimidating as he had imagined, and that he could step into it with courage, patience, and self-respect. The transformation was subtle but profound. He was still shy at times, still hesitant, but he was no longer paralyzed by fear. He had learned that life could be lived with openness, curiosity, and hope. And though the journey was far from over, he felt a quiet confidence for the first time. She had opened doors inside him that he never knew existed. She had shown him the power of patience, the value of trust, and the importance of self-respect. Most importantly, she had taught him that he could grow, change, and thrive, even after years of fear and doubt. He had begun to see himself in a new light, not as someone who would live in the shadows forever, but as someone capable of stepping into the world, learning, and finding connection. He didn't yet know what the future would bring. He didn't know if life would be easy or if every fear would vanish. But for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Bear. He had discovered a new strength, one built on understanding, trust, and courage. And as he walked home that evening, he realized that life had already begun to change, not because the world had shifted, but because he had. After weeks of learning and reflection, he realized that understanding lessons wasn't enough. Best. Knowing something in his mind felt very different from living it in daily life. She had taught him about courage, trust, and self-respect, but now he needed to take what he had learned and practice it. This was harder than he expected. Old habits and fears didn't disappear overnight. There were mornings when he woke up feeling small, shy, and unsure. He would remember her words and try to summon confidence, but sometimes it felt like an impossible task. He began by trying small things. At work, he started speaking up during meetings. Even if his voice shook or he worried about what others thought, he forced himself to contribute. He realized that no one was criticizing him as harshly as he had imagined. Each time he spoke, even for a few seconds, he felt a small spark of pride. Slowly, he began to believe that his ideas mattered and that people could listen to him with respect. Each step, though minor, built upon the last, creating a foundation he had never had before. Outside work, he tried reaching out to friends he had lost touch with over the years. It was awkward at first. Some didn't respond, some were busy, and a few seemed surprised that he was trying to reconnect. But he didn't let that stop him. He remembered the Apache girl's lessons about patience and self-compassion. She had taught him that rejection was not a reflection of his worth. It was simply part of life. By taking small risks, he started rebuilding connections and creating new friendships. Each conversation, each laugh shared, strengthened his confidence. One of the biggest challenges was learning to express his feelings honestly. For so long he had hidden behind silence, afraid that sharing would lead to judgment or rejection. But she had shown him that being open didn't make him weak. It made him human. Slowly, he began writing down his thoughts in a journal, practicing how to communicate emotions. Sometimes he shared small pieces with close friends. Sometimes he kept them to himself. But each word he expressed, each feeling he acknowledged, helped him feel more real, more connected to the world. Physical courage also became part of his growth. She had invited him to try activities that challenged him, like hiking steeper trails or kayaking in rivers he had previously avoided. At first he had hesitated, imagining failure or embarrassment. But she had always encouraged him gently, reminding him that fear was natural and that trying was what mattered. Each time he pushed past the fear, he discovered a new strength he didn't know he had. Despair, simple victories, like reaching the top of a hill or navigating a rapid safely, became symbols of his growing courage. He also began learning the power of helping others. She often explained that confidence wasn't just about self-improvement. It was about lifting others as well. Inspired by her, he volunteered at a local community center, helping children with their homework and organizing small events. He found joy in seeing others smile, in knowing he could make a difference no matter how small. These experiences helped him see himself as someone capable, kind, and valuable. The fear that had once consumed him began to shrink, replaced by purpose and connection. Despite these gains, progress was not linear. There were moments when he felt discouraged, when old fears returned with a strong grip. Sometimes he would avoid social events, hesitate to speak up, or retreat into solitude. But each time he remembered her advice. Growth takes time, patience, and persistence. But he learned to forgive himself for setbacks and to view them as part of the journey. Each stumble became an opportunity to try again, and each small success became proof that he was capable of change. He also began noticing subtle changes in his relationships with others. People responded to him differently, not because he was suddenly perfect, but because he carried himself with newfound calm and self-respect. He listened more, spoke thoughtfully, and showed genuine interest in others' lives. Friends and colleagues began trusting him more, valuing his opinions, and including him in activities. These positive interactions reinforced what she had taught him: that respect, kindness, and courage are contagious, and that the world responds to the energy you bring into it. Romantic feelings, too, started to emerge, though they were slow and cautious. For the first time, he imagined himself connecting with someone on a deeper level. He realized that the lessons she had given him about patience, trust, self-respect, and vulnerability were preparing him not just for friendship, but for meaningful relationships in the future. He no longer feared intimacy. He understood that connection began with honesty and mutual respect, not perfection or experience. He also learned to embrace solitude in a healthy way. Before, being alone had felt like punishment, a sign of failure. Now, he saw it as a chance to reflect, to recharge, and to practice self-care. He spent time walking in nature, meditating, reading, and journaling. These moments of quiet strengthened his mind and heart, helping him face life with balance and calm. He realized that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely, and that self-connection was the foundation for connecting with others. Over time, his self-image transformed. He began noticing strengths he had overlooked for years: patience, thoughtfulness, empathy, and resilience. He realized that he had been stronger than he thought all along, but fear had blinded him to his own abilities. With each small action, he rewrote the story he had told himself for decades. He was no longer invisible, timid, or unworthy. He was a person learning, growing, and capable of meaningful connections. One memorable moment occurred during a community hike. He helped a younger participant navigate a tricky path, guiding them with calm confidence. Seeing their gratitude and trust filled him with a sense of pride he had never experienced before. It was a clear sign of how far he had come, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but through steady effort, courage, and practice. He realized that change wasn't about big gestures. It was about consistent small actions that gradually reshaped his life. The reminded babe back. Through all these experiences, the Apache girl remained a quiet guide. She didn't control his growth or push him too far. She simply supported, encouraged, and believed in him. Her role was not to solve his problems, but to show him that he had the strength to solve them himself. But she taught him the value of mentorship, support, and positive influence. And through her presence, he learned that meaningful relationships could exist without pressure, judgment, or expectation. Only trust, respect, and mutual care. By the end of this period, he had become a different person in many ways.
He was still shy at times, still cautious, but he no longer allowed fear to dominate his choices.
He had learned to take risks, to trust others, to express his feelings, and to value himself. He had learned that growth is gradual, that setbacks are part of the journey, and that courage comes from acting despite fear. Most importantly, he had learned that change begins with the willingness to try, to learn, and to accept oneself. He began looking at life with anticipation instead of dread. He welcomed new experiences, knowing that each one offered a lesson. He greeted strangers with warmth, spoke more openly to colleagues, and approached friendships and potential relationships with patience and honesty. He realized that the world was not as scary as he had once imagined, and that he had the inner tools to face challenges with confidence and resilience. Through this journey, he discovered a profound truth. The most important lessons she had taught him were not about others, but about himself. She had guided him to see his worth, face his fears, and embrace life fully. And now, armed with patience, courage, and self-respect, he was ready to move forward, to face the unknown, and to write the next chapters of his life with confidence and hope. He knew there would still be challenges. Life was not suddenly easy, and old fears occasionally resurfaced, but he had learned how to face them. He had learned that setbacks were not failures, but opportunities to grow. And above all, he had learned that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. The quiet boy who had once believed he would live a lonely life was becoming someone who could step into the world fully, openly, and courageously. He had come a long way. Looking back, it almost felt unreal. The quiet, invisible boy who had once thought he would live alone, afraid of failure and rejection, now stood in a world that felt full of possibility. The lessons he had learned from the Apache girl had transformed him in ways he never imagined. Bess. Her guidance had not been about dramatic changes or instant solutions. It had been patient, gentle, and steady. Best. She had taught him that life was not a race, that growth takes time, and that every small step counts. And through her influence, he had discovered a new way of living, a way that was brave, thoughtful, and open-hearted. He still remembered the first moments they had met, the way she had smiled at him without judgment, and the calm confidence she carried in every gesture. At that time, he had been a boy filled with fear, carrying a quiet weight of loneliness and self-doubt. He had never imagined that someone could see him as he truly was and accept him fully. Yet, through her, he had learned that genuine connection was possible. He had learned that intimacy, true meaningful connection, was built not on experience or perfection, but on trust, respect, and honesty. Even though their paths were beginning to diverge, he felt no sadness in the way he might have expected. She had taught him something even more important than companionship. She had taught him to stand on his own. He understood now that his worth was not dependent on someone else's presence or approval. He had learned that his life could be meaningful even if challenges arose, and that he could carry forward the lessons she had given him to create a life of confidence and purpose. He began to notice the impact of her teachings in the most ordinary moments. When a colleague thanked him for helping solve a problem at work, he felt genuine pride instead of insecurity. When a friend shared a personal struggle, he could listen without fear, offering support and understanding rather than retreating into silence. He realized that his ability to connect with others, to empathize and offer kindness, was a direct result of the lessons she had taught him. Lessons about patience, trust, and self-respect. Each interaction reinforced his confidence, making him feel capable and alive. The growth he had experienced was not only internal, but also visible in his daily life. He stood taller, spoke more clearly, and engaged more fully with people. He no longer hesitated to share his ideas, to contribute, or to take initiative. The boy who had once feared being seen was now comfortable in the light, no longer hiding behind walls of fear. And yet he carried humility with him, understanding that growth was a journey without an end, and that every day was an opportunity to practice courage and self-respect. One afternoon, he revisited the park where they had first met. Memories of that day, the shy glance, the small conversation, the way she had simply listened, flooded back. He smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't just gratitude for meeting her, but for everything she had taught him. How to face his fears, how to trust himself and others, how to express his feelings, and how to step into the world with confidence. He understood now that the lessons were not hers alone. They were lessons he would carry forward for the rest of his life. He also realized the power of perspective. For years he had believed that his story was one of failure, loneliness, and fear. Now he understood that it had been a story of preparation. The quiet years, the struggles, the doubts, they had all shaped him. They had made him reflective, thoughtful, and ready to embrace the lessons she offered. Instead of viewing his past as wasted, he saw it as a foundation upon which he could build a stronger, wiser, and more compassionate self. As he continued moving forward, he began taking small risks he would have avoided before. He joined social groups, attended events, and started conversations with people he might have ignored. Each new experience reinforced his belief that he was capable of navigating the world with courage. He no longer feared rejection or failure as much, because he had learned that setbacks were temporary, and that each attempt was a step toward growth. The freedom he felt was unlike anything he had experienced before, the freedom to be himself fully and honestly. He also embraced the idea of mentoring and helping others, inspired by how she had guided him.
Whenever someone felt uncertain, lonely, or afraid, he found himself offering support and encouragement.
He understood the value of patience, listening, and gentle guidance. Through helping others, he realized that growth was not just personal. It was also about lifting those around him. And in doing so, he discovered a deep sense of purpose and fulfillment that had been missing from his life for so long. Romantic possibilities became less frightening, too. He realized that the fears that had once paralyzed him were not permanent barriers, but challenges he could face with honesty, patience, and respect. He understood that meaningful relationships were not about rushing or perfection, but about connection, communication, and mutual care. And although he had met the Apache girl first, he now felt prepared to engage with life and love in ways he had never imagined before. The lessons she had given him had opened doors inside him, doors he could now walk through confidently, knowing that he had the tools to navigate the world. He often reflected on the deeper impact of her presence in his life. She had not just changed his actions or behaviors. She had changed the way he thought about himself. She had helped him see that he was deserving of respect, trust, and care. She had shown him that vulnerability was a strength, that courage was built through practice, and that self-worth was something cultivated from within. And as he internalized these lessons, he felt a profound sense of peace, a sense that he could finally live authentically, free from the heavy burden of fear that had shadowed him for so long. There were quiet moments when he still remembered his old fears, the loneliness, the self-doubt, the thoughts that he would never belong. But now, those fears no longer controlled him. He met them with awareness, patience, and self-compassion, and in facing them, he realized that life was not defined by what he had feared, but by the courage he showed in moving forward. Each day became an opportunity to practice bravery, kindness, and openness, and each day reinforced the truth that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. One evening, as he walked along a familiar path in the park, he realized that he had grown into a person he would have admired years ago. He carried confidence without arrogance, kindness without weakness, and courage without recklessness. He had learned that life was not about waiting for someone to save you, but about learning to live fully, with awareness and heart. The Apache girl had been the guide, the spark, the catalyst, but the journey had ultimately been his. And for that, he felt gratitude, pride, and hope. In the quiet of that moment, he understood that life's lessons often come in unexpected forms. A single person, a brief encounter, a kind word, or a patient presence could change the course of a lifetime.
He thought about how he had once believed he would die alone, invisible, and unworthy.
That thought now seemed distant, almost unbelievable. Through connection, patience, courage, and love, he had discovered a path to growth, fulfillment, and authentic living. He had learned that life could surprise you in ways you never expect, and that change was always possible if you are willing to embrace it. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. His story was not about fear, shame, or missed opportunities. It was about discovery, courage, and transformation. The quiet boy who had once believed he would live alone had become someone who could face life fully, embrace connection, and trust himself. And though the Apache girl had been a crucial part of his journey, he understood that the greatest lesson she had given him was not about her. It was about himself. Patient. As he walked into the evening, he felt a sense of readiness for whatever life would bring next. The journey was far from over, but he was no longer afraid. He had discovered his strength, his worth, and the joy of authentic living. He knew now that life was meant to be experienced fully, and that every connection, every challenge, and every small victory added richness and meaning to the journey. And with that realization, he stepped forward into a future filled with hope, courage, and the knowledge that he was capable of living a life he had once only dreamed of.